Okay, let's play some damn chess. I just stuttered up that 1300 something rate. Wait, son of a bitch.
It's incredible.
Fucking slut.
Thought you knew what they were doing. It's incredible. Amazing.
The fuck is this shit?
It's quite moved. You know, in the stillness now of the morning and just with
Get that.
the bird song. It's just remarkable.
Get that slutty night out of you, slut.
Remarkable Persepolis may be,
Fucking slut.
but history has never given it its due.
That slut
Most of what
now,
we know about
slut.
it we have gleaned from Greek accounts. The Persians themselves left little written history behind.
You want to swap whores? Come on, let's swap whores. Okay, we'll swap whores. Let's swap whores. Fucking
They defeat
slut.
them in battle, and it's the victors who write the history books. The Greeks like to paint themselves as the creators of all things civilized, and the Persians as cruel, despotic, and backward.
We in the West identify with a Greco-Roman tradition.
That slutty bitch
Works
about you,
of
slut.
Greek and Latin authors, and they are going to downplay the importance of Persia in its historical setting. They're going to say that the Persians are barbarians, and this is the theme that comes over time and time and time again in the sources.
Yet the Persians cannot be dismissed so easily. For 250 years they ruled the largest empire the world had ever seen. It had humble beginnings, among the nomadic tribes who lived on the Persian plains. In 550 BC, Cyrus, a tribal leader, set off with his army on a campaign of conquest. With his charisma and what the Greeks called the fear he inspired and the terror he struck in all men, Cyrus took control of more and more territory. In just 30 years, he laid the foundations of an empire that would stretch from the borders of India in the east, to Greece on the Mediterranean, down to Egypt and Ethiopia, and up to what is now Russia. More than 30 different peoples were brought together under the rule of the man who called himself the King of the World. And at the heart of this empire stood Persepolis.
Get that slutty
the
bitch
greatest
about
of
you,
all Persian
slut.
cities, and the key to understanding the achievements of the ancient Persians. Persepolis was begun around 515 BC by Darius the Great, the fourth king in the Persian dynasty known as the Achaemenids. But much of what we can see today lay hidden under the sands for 2,000 years. It was only in
Get
the
that
1930s
slutty night
that
out of you,
the wonders
slut.
of Persepolis were finally uncovered. Whole staircases adorned with perfectly preserved reliefs were seen for the very first time.
No one dreamed of the regal splendors which their excavation would reveal to the world. For more than 22 centuries, the capital of the Persian Empire lay neglected.
As well as the reliefs, archaeologists found some less spectacular artifacts that would prove vital in uncovering the secrets of the ancient Persians.
Come on, slut.
30,000 fragments of these tiny clay tablets were found among the rubble of Persepolis.
Oh, you're trying to Jenna has Uzi
They
on me.
provide one of the few sources
That
of
shit will
information
not work, you
about the
slut.
workings of the empire, written by the Persians themselves. The marks on the tablets are the ancient Persian script known as cuneiform. Dr. Maria Brosius is one of only a handful of scholars in the world who can decipher what is written on the tablets.
What we have here is an example of a clay tablet found in Persepolis. A scribe would pick up a piece of wet clay and he would then hold it in his left
fucking
hand,
slut.
and that fits perfectly into the shape of your hand, really. And then he would inscribe it. It's an extraordinary feeling to know that something like this has survived, to tell us about life 2,500 years ago, information that we otherwise would never have. They tell me something about how people lived and how this empire worked. That's what fascinates
Come
me.
on, you fucking slut.
So what can the tablets tell us about Persepolis? The tablets are the receipts and invoices of the empire,
Come on, you
including
slut.
those for the workers who built Persepolis. One records 1.5 shekels of silver for carpenters making sculptures. Another details 1 jug of wine each to the 74 Syrian labourers working on the
God
columned hall.
damn it.
Yet another 2.5 shekels for the carrion gold workers.
The amount of gold that seems to be used here indicates that, again, you know, the
Come
cost
on, you
of the site
fucking
must have
slut.
been immeasurable.
From the information on the tablets, we can deduce what materials once decorated these massive buildings.
Fucking slut.
For decades, we have seen only the stone pillars and walls. But now we can recreate the halls and palaces of Persepolis in all their dazzling splendor. As we do so, we can see why Persepolis was once known as the richest city under the sun. Access to the complex was through the Gate of All Nations. Human-headed bulls announced to visitors they were entering the heart of royal Persian power. It was covered with a cedar wood roof, its doors adorned with gold fittings. At the heart of the complex was the Apadana, where King Darius received his subjects.
Okay, you
Today, only
slut.
10 of the original columns
You
still
just
stand.
fucked up, you slut. You just fucked up, you
In
slut.
antiquity, 36 columns, 20 meters high, held up another massive cedarwood ceiling. The walls were covered in sumptuous hangings. This enormous hall could accommodate 10,000 people.
Something that was built with columns 20 meters high. I think it was awe-inspiring. People were probably looking up and were completely stunned.
Come on, you slut.
You can see how each of these columns rear up to the sky. And they would have held up there an enormous roof of
Slut.
cedar
Get that
wood,
slut in that, you slut.
giving us this heady scent of cedar wherever we went as well.
King after king added to Darius' creation. Xerxes, the Greeks' great foe, this the remarkable Hall of 100 Columns. And finally, we can recreate the private quarters of Darius himself, a place that only the king's most intimate advisors would ever have seen.
It would have been dimly lit, but light would have been streaming through window spaces. And in fact, we can tell from
Come
some
on,
of the
you slut.
polished stone around here that this would have been gleaming. In fact, some people have called this room the Hall of Mirrors.
The building sat on a 15-meter high man-made terrace.
Fucking slut.
In terms of beauty, it's difficult to find the right words, really. As a feature, it's an architectural symphony. Everything is built to harmonize with one another. Each building is synchronized with another one to make a beautiful, harmonized whole.
Persepolis is one of the great architectural
God
achievements
damn
of
it.
the ancient world.
God damn it. God
Why
damn
do
it.
Persian kings go to such lengths? Beyond housing the royal
God
entourage,
damn it.
what exactly was the purpose of these extraordinary buildings?
God damn it.
Over 2,500 years ago, the Persians built the greatest city on earth, from which they ruled most of the known world. But this was no ordinary city.
He is celebrated as one of the greatest kings in history. A child chosen by God himself to become a slayer of giants.
Well, one of the greatest mysteries about the story of David and Goliath is quite simply to ask the question, who really killed Goliath?
He is thought to be the author of the Psalms, a gentle shepherd with a poetic nature.
Was David a righteous leader or a bloody murderer? Why not both?
He is none other than King David. But no historical mention of David is made outside the Bible. The biggest
Get
mystery of all
slut out of here.
is whether he even existed.
You have scholars who say that the whole story is a late invention, that there was no David.
In 1993, a stone fragment is unearthed at an archaeological site in northern Israel called Tel Dan. It would come as a surprise to scholars, a clue they had never expected. Would it end
Fucking
thousands of
slut.
years of speculation about King David's existence?
Get that slutty nut out of you,
Who
slut.
was King David? And what would be the ultimate destiny of one hand-picked by God? These are but a few of the mysteries of the Bible.
Get that slutty nut out of you, slut. Oh, you fucking slut. Slut. God damn it. God damn it.
Just outside
God
the gates
damn
of
it.
ancient Jerusalem, a monument stands silently for one of the sons of King David, Absalom.
God damn it.
The tomb is revealing not so much as an artifact of history, but for what it suggests about the mysterious
Holy
destiny
fucking
of
slut.
Absalom's father, the young shepherd boy who would become God's chosen king. For centuries, people have come here to throw stones at the tomb and to warn wayward children about the cost of misbehaving. The Bible tells us that Absalom would rise up against his father in open revolt, bringing shame
Come on,
and the
fucking
wrath of God
slut.
against all of Israel. Some believe that the story of David and his rebellious son is merely fiction, that the tale of King
Come on,
David is nothing
slut.
but allegory. But as archaeologists digging in the Holy Land well know,
Slut.
the earth has not revealed all its secrets. It is
Come on,
in the
slut.
summer of 1993 that a stone fragment is discovered by archaeologist Avram Biran at a site in Israel called Tel Dan.
Some have called it the discovery of the century.
Come on, fucking
The
slut.
find creates a frenzy in the academic community.
Dr. Biran has found a great archaeological find.
You fucking slut.
In the early 30s,
Stupid.
he's made the discovery of a
Fucking
lifetime.
slut.
Concealed from sight for 2,900 years, it proclaims the battle victories of a major king in Syria during the 9th century before the Common Era.
Fuck
In
you,
part
I
it
ain't taking the
reads,
draw.
I fought
I'm gonna
against
kick
Israel
your ass.
and slew the
Slut.
king of the house of David.
You have scholars who say that the whole story is a late invention, that there was no David. Then you have an
Oh,
archaeological
you want to
find.
stall? Your black ass wants to
Which
stall even if you,
refers
though you're, if you are white? I'll
The
put your
house of
black
David,
ass.
the dynasty of David. So, if you needed that as proof, then here you have it.
For the first time in history, a reference to an actual historical David is found outside the pages of the Bible.
Screw you.
Now, to find at Dan, which is far away from Jerusalem, a reference to the dynasty of David, to the name David, was in itself an unusual event.
It is a discovery which is, arguably, one of the most important archaeological finds since the unearthing of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It is the tangible remains of a dynasty that would begin in the tiny hamlet of Bethlehem. "1,000 years before the birth of Jesus, ancient Israel is just a budding nation, and David is merely a child. To God's dismay, the Israelites insist upon having a king. The prophet Samuel is chosen to anoint Saul, the new royal leader of Israel. Saul is a dark and brooding character who never finds favor in God's eyes. King Saul is continually subject to melancholy and fits of rage. A member of Saul's court suggests that a musician might be just the medicine needed to soothe the king's inner demons.
And the Lord was sorry that he had ever made Saul king of Israel. Finally, the Lord said to Samuel, "You have mourned long enough for Saul, for I have rejected him as king of Israel." The Lord said to Samuel, "Take a vial of olive oil and go to Bethlehem and find a man named Jesse, for I have selected one of his sons to be the new king." 1 Samuel 16:1.
The mystery to me about David's childhood is what in it made him David. This is one of the most interesting, vital, powerful characters in history. And we have only one hint. The one hint that we have is when Samuel came to David to anoint him, he was out back tending the sheep. And the idea that David as a child was a shepherd is a very powerful idea, because you find often in the Bible that leaders, Moses, David, Jacob, are shepherds, because they learn how to treat those who are dependent on them.
And so, a young shepherd boy begins his journey to the throne. He could not know how perilous a journey it would be.
One of them
I'm
said he
going
knew a
through
young
your
fellow
damn
in
rook.
Bethlehem, the son of a man
Slut.
named Jesse, who was not only a talented harp player, but was handsome, brave, and strong, and had good solid judgment. What's more, he added, the Lord is with him. 1 Samuel 16:18.
David leaves his family and travels to Saul's court. And indeed, when he plays his harp for Saul, it has a calming effect on the troubled king.
The relationship between Saul and David is a very complex one. Saul's first reaction to David is very positive. We're told that he loved David, which is a term that has not only emotional but political overtones. That is, he became committed and accepted David as an important member of his staff.
In addition to being a musician, David is also a poet. While he is largely believed to be the author of many of the Psalms, some scholars disagree.
The idea that David had anything to do with the Psalms is probably a very early tradition that associates David's role early on in Saul's court as a singer and a player with the fact that the Psalms were documents that were sung and used in worship. That's probably why the association was made. But we have very strong doubts as to whether any of those Psalms were actually written by David. It's a nice tradition, but highly unlikely.
I think that David did write many of the Psalms, and that if you read them carefully, they do reflect the evolution of his own character and his own story.
Although a success at poetry and music, David will also need other skills, the skills of a fighter. He is headed on a collision course with King Saul. That collision course would begin here in the Elah Valley. For here is where the Israelites are confronted by the Philistines and their giant warrior, Goliath.
Then Goliath, the Philistine champion, came out of the ranks to face the forces of Israel. He was a giant of a man, measuring over 9 feet tall, and his armor-bearer walked ahead of him with a huge shield. 1 Samuel 17:1.
David recognized a rule of battle that became more important as history progressed, which is, if you can strike from a distance, it doesn't matter how strong your enemy is.
Then he picked up 5 smooth stones from a stream and put them in his shepherd's bag, and armed only with his shepherd's staff and sling, started across to Goliath. When the Philistine began moving closer to attack, David ran quickly to engage him. Reaching into his bag, he took out a stone, which he slung and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank in, and the man fell to the ground upon his face. 1 Samuel 17:48.
It is one of the most famous stories in the Bible. What is less known is that in later verses the Bible contradicts itself.
We have this wonderful story about David being the conqueror of Goliath, but then later on in the Bible, there's a kind of cast-off sentence that says, oh, and by the way, Elhanan, who of course was the one who killed Goliath. And the reader has to stop and say, hey, wait a minute, I thought that was David.
In fact, the mysterious Elhanan is mentioned twice as the slayer of Goliath, once in 2 Samuel and once in the book of Chronicles. Nothing else is known about this character. Was Elhanan the actual slayer of Goliath? Was the story rewritten to honor a new king?
The original story of Goliath has been certainly expanded now to take in David and to be part of his colorful history.
David returns triumphantly to Saul's court, a new young hero.
All of a sudden, the jealousy is almost unbearable, and that begins slowly to push Saul over the edge.
The king's household is now an uneasy place, and the stage is set for royal intrigue, dramatic and deadly, as King Saul sets out to kill David. Having just returned from his triumph over Goliath, David's popularity in Israel is growing, even it seems at the expense of King Saul.
Perhaps the greatest mystery in the Bible is why God falls in love with certain people. God falls in love with Abraham. God falls in love with Moses, and God falls in love with David. And from his youth, David has this magic and charisma that God is with him. Today we would use that word. We would say David had a certain charisma and a certain skill and a certain luck. But in that time, it was spoken of very differently. That what David had was around him the presence of God.
This would not prevent him from feeling the wrath of an increasingly jealous King Saul. In a fit of torment, Saul hurls a spear at David's head, which narrowly misses him. It is only the first of several attempts Saul is to make on David's life. To escape certain death, David flees into the Judean wilderness with a small band of men.
The period of David as outlaw is another mystery which I would really like to know more about. What we know is that David went into the Judean wilderness, south of Jerusalem, east of Hebron, in that whole wild area on the edge of the desert. We know that discontented men, 400 of them, says the Bible, discontented men joined him there.
King Saul pursues David into the wilderness. According to ancient Hebrew legend, Saul and his men are about to enter a cave in which David is hiding. God sends a spider to weave a web over the mouth of the cave. Saul's men pass by, thinking it could not possibly be occupied. Still in pursuit of David and his men, King Saul tracks David to a desert oasis by the Dead Sea called En-Gedi. It is here, among En-Gedi's waterfalls and lush green gardens, that David gets the opportunity to stop running for his life. Saul wanders into a cave in which David is hiding, and for a moment, the king is utterly vulnerable to the man he is hunting.
Slut!
Now's the time, David's men whispered to him. Today is the day the Lord will deliver Saul into your power. 1 Samuel 24:4.
David said, I can't kill him. He's the anointed of the Lord. He is the king. But he crept up and he cut off a corner of his coat. Symbolic. He cut off a corner of his coat. And Saul got up and went out, and he never knew anything that happened. And when Saul got to the other side of the mountain and David was safe, he called out, Saul. Saul said, is that you, my son David? This love, hate, love. He's come to kill him. He said, is that you, my son David? And David said, look, here's your coat. I could have killed you, and I didn't.